If you're beachcombing in New Jersey and you want to find out what that shell is that you've just encountered, this video is for you. In this video, we're going to go through some of the most common types of shells found on the South Jersey beaches. The shells in this video are bivalves, which are the shells that have two halves that are connected with a muscle, and gastropods, which are snails. To start, I'm going to go through all of the different varieties, and then I can talk about them separately a little bit later in the video. So up here we have whelk shells. These are two different kinds. It's a knobbed whelk and a channeled whelk. Then here we have what's known as a shark eye shell. That's where you see the hermit crabs hanging out in. Here are jingles, and these are slipper shells. These ones are all types of bay scallops. Down here we have two varieties of mussels. These are called ribbed mussels, and then these smoother ones are called blue mussels. Here we have a cross-hatched leucine, which is not terribly common, but you will find them in very small. And this is a stout tegulus shell. Down here we have jackknife razor shells. Over here we have a really common shell, the oyster. Then all these are arc shells. There's a couple different varieties of arc shells that I'll talk about. And then we have the quahogs. And then at the top here, and probably the most common shell found on the Jersey beaches, are surf clams. We're going to start right up here at the top. These two are both whelks, but they're two different kinds of whelks. These are gastropods. This is the more common of the two. It's called a knobbed whelk. It has these little knobs on the top of what this is called the spire. These can get very big, such as these two examples. This one is a channeled whelk. You can see the way the spire is squared off and has shoulders. Also, the body of this one is more pear-shaped. Incidentally, the knobbed whelk is the state shell of New Jersey. The other set of gastropods here are all shark eye shells. They're great shells, and they're often really beautiful. These are a type of snail, and they're predatory snails. For instance, when you find a shell that has one single hole bored in it, it's normally because a shark eye has been there and gotten a meal from that bivalve. There's also a type of snail called a moon snail, and the shell is very similar, but it doesn't have this little button on the bottom. I can show a moon snail to you right now. Here's a good comparison between a moon snail shell and a shark eye. Now, if you notice, they look very similar, right? Well, when I turn over the moon snail, you see it's got the wraparound but no button on the bottom of it. And then this shark eye, it's got like a covering over top of this little donut hole here. So that's a shark eye, and this is a moon snail. All the rest of these shells are bivalves or filter feeders. In fact, the common oyster can filter up to 50 gallons of water in a 24-hour period. Probably the most common shell you'll find on the South Jersey beaches are these surf clams. They can be tiny in size, and they can get really big. For the most part, the shell is fairly symmetrical and like a triangle almost. The next type of bivalve are these. These are quahogs. Quahogs are usually really thick shells, very heavy, and oftentimes appear on the beaches intact because they're so heavy and stout. Now, these seem to have heavier ridges on the shell, but the most defining characteristic is this curved top where it would attach to the other side of the shell. You can see that those are more symmetrical and more triangle shaped, and these quahogs have kind of like a hook depending on which side you found. They also tend to have this purplish tint on the inside, which is a really nice feature. Another really common shell on the South Jersey beaches are these bay scallops. The bay scallops have ribs that kind of radiate from a central point. They're oftentimes found with their ears. That's the squared off edges on the where the hinge is on the shell. And if you're looking for color in shells, this is the shell you want to look for, because they can come in great color varieties, from yellow orangey to pinks and purples, blues, even like pale whites. These shells give the South Jersey beaches great color. The next colorful shell that I want to talk about are these. They're called jingle shells. And these are normally really flat shells. And I oftentimes say they look like a cornflake. They come in bright yellows, oranges, silver, and sometimes, or often, they're very dark, because that means that they've been in the sea floor. The next shell are these slipper shells. Now, the reason they're called a slipper shell, because if you turn them over, they almost look like a slipper. They're also called oyster pests, and a lot of times when you see horseshoe crabs on the beach, you'll see that these guys have been attached to the horseshoe crab, or anything that's been in the water for a long time. Probably the only bivalve shell that you'll find as much as surf clams are oyster shells, and they can be an unbelievable variety of shapes and sizes. So here's just a small example of what an oyster shell looks like. And these are really thick shells, so they oftentimes wash up intact. And a lot of times you'll find them with these imprints on them, and that's because they like to grow in clusters, and that's probably an imprint from another oyster shell. The insides of these shells can be really beautiful, color and iridescent. And these are really prolific filter feeders. The next shells are a type of shell, but there's 3 different varieties. These are called arc shells. And just like the bay scallops, they have these ribs on them. And they come in 3 different types. There are blood arcs, and the reason they call them blood arcs is because they actually have red blood. But for the most part, blood arcs are circular in shape, and they have kind of a hook towards the top of them. The next type of arc is called a ponderous arc, and that is a more rectangular or trapezoid shaped shell. And also, if you look at the shell from a specific angle, it almost looks like a crashing wave. But you see how the shell isn't roundish, it's more rectangular. Now, the last type of arc is called a transverse arc, and we were only able to find a really small variety of them. But for the most part, the transverse arc has most of its ribs radiating from a central part. Those are all arc shells. Another really common shell that you'll find on the South Jersey beaches are mussel shells. Now, there are 2 types of mussel shells. There's the blue mussel, which has kind of a more smooth shell. And then there's the ribbed mussel, and that has these ridges on it. An easy shell to identify are these. They're called a jackknife razor or an Atlantic razor shell. These are long shells compared to other shells, and they're skinny, and they look kind of like a jackknife. Now, these last 2 types of shells are something They're not terribly common, but you will come across them. And one of them is my favorite shell. So let's start with that. This shell is called the stout tegalis. Now it's similar to a razor shell, but it's much squarer. We're only able to find one of them in a week's worth of beachcombing, so they're not terribly common, but you will encounter them once in a while. And then finally, a shell that's a very small shell here in Jersey, and that's called the crosshatch leucine. These have a very distinctive pattern on their shell that goes in two directions, and we can only ever find them in really small varieties. These are about the size of like a dime, maybe even smaller than a dime. So that's pretty much the roundup of the most common shells you'll find on the South Jersey beaches. Now, if you think you learned something from this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel if you want to see some of our beachcombing adventures.